Say, kids, what time is it?
Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mr. Pitiful podcast. I'm your boss podcaster, Mr. Pitiful.
That's the name they gave me.
Coming at you live and direct from a suspicious-looking warehouse at Area 51. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If this is your first time, I am Mr. Pitiful. I just basically tell stories about my life in the music and entertainment business. And today I'm going to talk about working with Ozzy Osbourne. God rest his soul. Really sorry to hear about his passing, but I thought it might bring some of you a little bit of comfort who are maybe struggling with his passing to just tell some stories about what it was like to work with Ozzy. I will say Ozzy's passing was a little harder on me than I expected. I was not particularly close with Ozzy. It wasn't like we were on a first-name basis or anything, but the truth of the matter is, it is a little weird when somebody you knew personally passes, whether you guys were close or not. So I thought this would be a good time to talk about sort of my exploits with the Ozman. So growing up, I wouldn't necessarily say that I was like an Ozzy fanboy or anything like that. Like, I loved Ozzy, I loved heavy metal music, I loved rock and roll music, I loved hair bands, I loved all that stuff. But the truth is, Ozzy was a little scary to me. Now, you have to remember, this is the 80s when the whole satanic panic thing was in full swing. So, the media, Tipper Gore, the government, all these people were all up in arms, clutching their pearls about heavy metal music and how, our youth are all going to die and everybody's going to turn into some Satan worshiper and all this kind of thing. And it was completely hyperbolic and completely ridiculous. But Ozzy was scary. And I do remember reading about him biting the head off of the bat and the pigeon and that sort of thing. And his image, when I saw him on MTV and stuff, he was a scary guy. But when I got into heavy metal full on, I don't recall owning like any Ozzy shirts or anything. I was more into like Metallica and Anthrax and Slayer and that sort of thing. But I was an Ozzy fan, and probably more in the context of Black Sabbath. Like, when I was a kid, I thought Black Sabbath was just like the scariest, edgiest band you could listen to. And I do remember sort of taking the Iron Man song from Black Sabbath and just kind of playing it over and over again. And I especially would rewind it back to the sort of, I am Iron Man kind of part. And just that first riff, dun, dun, I would kind of play it through and rewind it back and just listen to it over and over again. I was obsessed with Tony Iommi's guitar playing and sort of the way he double-tracked the guitars and that sort of thing. So even though I wouldn't consider myself like a huge Ozzy Osbourne fanboy, when I did get into the music business and it occurred to me that I was probably going to meet some celebrities at some point, Ozzy was one of my number one people that I hoped I would get to meet someday. So there's that. So let me kind of take you through the timeline of my Ozzy experience. So one of the first big gigs I ever worked as a stagehand, just starting out to be like an aspiring audio engineer, was the 1998 MTV Video Music Awards. I was backstage during the afternoon, like rehearsals and blocking and, technical run-throughs and all of that. And I was backstage watching the Beastie Boys rehearse, which was just bonkers. I was like losing my mind back there. I was always a huge Beastie Boys fan. And I could kind of see through the curtain, and I kind of peeked out at what would have been the audience. But instead of, the audience being there, the chairs were full of these giant cue cards. And the cue cards in black ink had the names of all the celebrities that would be sitting there later in the evening. So the camera guys could like whip the camera around and sort of focus on those people. And I remember looking out there and seeing some of the names, Mariah Carey and stuff like that. But when I looked out, there's Ozzy Osbourne's name on one of the cue cards. And I just remember thinking to myself, I was like 21 years old, going like, wow, like in a couple hours, Ozzy's going to be sitting in that seat, you know? So it was pretty mind-blowing stuff. But personally, I never dreamed in a million years I'd get to meet Ozzy, right? Well, fast forward to a few years later, I was a manager at a rental company, right? We worked up in the valley renting equipment to recording studios, post-production houses, you know, stuff like that. And when I got the rental orders on my desk, I could always see what studio was renting, what record label was paying, and then additionally who the artist was. And I would see Ozzy's name pop up on these rental orders from time to time. And the curious thing was my boss, you know, he was a former engineer and a former producer. And, you know, he always had war stories from the studio. And I remember one of the stories he told me was that years ago he was engineering a record, and it was probably the late 70s, early 80s, and Ozzy come into the studio all drunk, and he was kind of hitting him up, you know, hey man, you know, I can't wait, you know, I want to have you like, you know, engineer my solo record and that sort of thing. And my boss actually turned it down because he didn't think Ozzy would be anything without Black Sabbath. Boy, did he regret that decision. But I always thought it was cool, you know, seeing his name on the rental orders and stuff like that. I ended up getting laid off from the rental job as kind of the digital thing became more ubiquitous, and people were kind of doing more DIY recordings and stuff like that. So the demand was kind of starting to wane a little bit. But they called me in and said, basically, we're laying you off. You have 2 weeks to find a new job, and, you know, we hope you land on your feet and that sort of thing. So my plan was, because I'd been doing recon at all these recording studios for the last, you know, couple years, I had a pretty good idea of what studios I wanted to work at and maybe what studios I thought I would be a good fit at. So I had 3 of them in my mind. I printed up some really nice professional resumes on like good paper and good graphics and that sort of thing. And I went and applied at all 3 studios. About a week later, I was sitting in Venice Beach having lunch, and my phone rang, and it was a Hollywood number that I did not recognize, so I answered it. And I don't want to use the names of the studios because I don't want you guys calling them or showing up there or posting up outside to take pictures and stuff. I'd rather just, you know, leave all that stuff out of it. But let's just call them Studio A, Studio B, and Studio C. So I pick up the phone, and it's Studio A calling, saying, hey, we got your resume. We kind of know who you are. We've seen you around, you know, delivering gear and stuff. We'd love to have you in for an interview. So I couldn't even believe it. Like, I was completely chuffed. I was like, wow. So yeah. So obviously set up an interview with them, you know, for a couple days out or something like that. And then I hang up the phone. And about 10 minutes later, my phone rings again with another Hollywood number I don't recognize. And I answer it, and it's Studio B calling. And I can't even believe it. And same thing, like, hey, we got your resume. We kind of know who you are. We'd love to have you in for an interview. Now, Studio C never called. I ended up working for them later, which is a whole other podcast in itself. We'll maybe talk about that someday. But I've got 2 interviews lined up with 2 of the dopest studios in the world, and I can't even believe it. Now, to give you some kind of context, Studio A was kind of more of a rock and roll and heavy metal studio. So I felt like I would probably be a better fit at that particular facility. Studio B, they did do some rock and roll and stuff like that, but they kind of had a more diverse clientele, a lot of pop type stuff. So it's the kind of studio where you would see, I don't know, Britney Spears, Beyonce, Justin Timberlake. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but that just personally wasn't my bag. So as far as my background goes, I was kind of like a heavy metal rock and roll kid turned deadhead, but I still listened to some metal, you know, even though I was into the Dead at that point. So I had both of these interviews lined up. So I go to the Studio A interview, and I'm sitting there and I'm interviewing with the head engineer, and my mind is just blown because he's already telling me like who he currently has in-house, and it's just all these big rock and roll guys. It's like Ozzy, obviously. He's got Rod Stewart in, he's got Alice Cooper in, and my mind is just blown. And basically, long story short, I end up getting hired. So I actually canceled the interview with Studio B. I didn't want to do the whole like, oh, let me interview with these guys and get back to you and miss my opportunity. Like, basically, when they made me a job offer, I jumped on it. Said, yes, absolutely, totally want to work here. I'm all in, let's go. So I get hired, right? So my first day, I'm being trained, you know, there's kind of a lot to learn, and I want to be abundantly clear. I was not hired as an engineer. I was not hired as a producer. I was hired as a production assistant or a runner, T-boy, gopher, whatever you want to call it. But basically my job was client liaison and studio liaison. So making pots of coffee, doing food runs, maintaining the studio, and it was very strict and militaristic. The level of expectation was very high. Like each phone in the common area had to have like 2 pads of paper, 6 sharpened number, 2 pencils, 6 pens with black ink, 6 pens with blue ink, and I mean, if like there were only 5 black pens there, like you'd get your ass chewed. That was just how it went. Like it was a very, very crazy job. But I'm sitting there being trained, and Ozzy's in one of our main studios, and I've got my eye out for him and I don't see him anywhere. But meanwhile, it's still crazy because like I walk around the corner and here comes Mike Bordin, who's Faith No More's drummer originally, but who played drums for Ozzy. And I'd been to a couple Ozfests and seen Mike play with Ozzy. So I'm already like freaking out. I'm like, dude, there's freaking Mike Bordin. And then I come around the corner and there's freaking Rob Trujillo, who now plays for Metallica, but you might know him previously as playing for Suicidal Tendencies and the Infectious Grooves, stuff like that. Also, we had other studios operating at the same time, so I'm still totally freaking out because it's like, oh my God, there's Rod Stewart. Oh my God, there's Leland Sklar. Oh my God, there's Kenny Aronoff. Like, my mind is just blown. But the whole time I've got my radar up looking for Ozzy. And a couple days go by, probably 2-3 days, something like that, and still no Ozzy. And then I want to say it was about the 3rd or 4th day, I get called into the studio to do a food order, but it's complete chaos. Like I walk in and basically I get completely ignored because there's just so much going on in there. They've got like technicians in there working on stuff. They've got multiple engineers on there running around. They've got like some of the rental companies dropping off and picking up gear. So nobody even really notices I'm there. So I'm just kind of standing by with my mouth shut, kind of waiting to, have somebody give me some direction on what they want. And I look over and I see this arm resting on our audio console, like fully sleeved out, super intricate, high-end, like color bomb tattoos. And I'm just like transfixed. I was big into tattoos back then. The early 2000s, there was kind of a big tattoo renaissance where sort of like pigments got better and techniques were getting better. And there was some really good color bomb tattooing going on at that time in LA. And I'm so transfixed by staring at this full sleeve tattoo, I don't even realize it's Ozzy's arm resting on the console. I'm just staring at this arm, and then eventually the producer notices I'm there and says, "Oh, hey mate, Ozzy needs something to eat then." And I was like, "Wait, what? Ozzy?" And I look, and the chair swings around, and I realize the arm I've been staring at was Ozzy. And I was just like, "Oh my God!" So in a moment of pure humility, I just got down on one knee and I said, "Hey man, so they tell me you're hungry." And Ozzy's kind of like, "Oh mate, I'm good. I'll just like have a bagel or something, And everybody's like, no, Ozzy, you need to eat. It's going to be a long day, blah, blah, blah. So I was so blown away by what had just happened. Like, I don't even remember what he ordered, but I used to carry a little pen and notepad around with me and wrote everything down and went and got food for him. And it was like bucket list accomplishment number 1 happened. I just freaking met Ozzy Osbourne. This is crazy. Now, usually when they book these big studios like this, they book them for weeks or sometimes months on end. So this obviously wasn't my last encounter with Ozzy. So I have a couple funny stories just kind of going over the weeks and the months that sort of happened that I want to share with you guys. One story didn't happen to me personally, and I did not witness this personally, but I still think it's a good story. The engineer actually told me this story, and I have no reason to not believe it, so I will share it with you all. But basically what happened was kind of in between when Ozzy was recording his new material, they were going back to the archives with a different producer, and what they were doing was kind of remixing and remastering the old stuff, like the Randy Rhoads days, like old stuff. And if you're familiar with those recordings, you might know that the fidelity isn't necessarily the best, even though the performance is freaking killer. So basically what the plan was to leave Ozzy's vocals alone and leave Randy Rhoads' guitar stuff alone, but they were going to kind of re-record the drums and bass. And with the digital audio workstations, you can like overdub on top of the original performances and like in the computer digitally line everything back up like exactly the way it was. Like back then they had a program called Beat Detective. So you could literally take a fingerprint of Tommy Aldridge's drums or whoever played drums on the original, and you could basically line Mike Bordin's drums up exactly like sample level accuracy to the original performance. So that was the plan, and that's what they were doing. Well, the engineer tells me one day Ozzy comes in and they have Mike's drums set up, ready to overdub these new drum parts. And Ozzy starts getting upset, and they're like, "What's wrong?" And Ozzy says, "Well, there was 2 bass drums on this original recording." And they were like, "No, we have the original 2-inch tape here. We have the original track sheets here. We've already loaded the old drums into Pro Tools. You can see there's only 1 bass drum." And Ozzy kept insisting. He said, "Look, I was there. I remember the song had 2 bass drums on it." So you know what? They said, "Fine, Ozzy, no problem." So they called the rental company that rented the drums and said, "Hey, we need another bass drum and another mallet, another pedal. Please send it over." So basically what they did was they set up a second bass drum, set up a second microphone, pretended to plug it in and all of that stuff, but it actually wasn't patched or bussed to anything. It was just there for looks. So Ozzy would look through the glass, see 2 bass drums, and he was happy, and they went ahead and re-recorded the track. So I used to tell my students when I taught recording arts technologies that a big part of my job was just playing mind chess with the client. And it's just funny to me that like these engineers were playing mind chess with one of the biggest icons of rock and roll and totally got away with it. So I don't know if this is a true story, but it's a good story. And again, I have no reason to not believe the engineer on that. So we're going to go ahead and say that that's a true story. Now, as far as some of my stories go with Ozzy, one thing that I thought was kind of funny looking back now, it was stressful at the time, but looking back, it's kind of funny now. Part of our job as production assistants or runners, whatever you want to call us, is we had to watch the front desk and man the phones when our receptionist was away. And I kind of had a love-hate relationship with the phones at this studio because you never know who's going to be on the other end of that phone. It could be a crank caller. It could be a huge celebrity. It could be little girls asking if is Hanson recording there, stuff like that. So did you get my demo tape? You never knew who was going to freaking call. So I'm sitting there manning the phones one day, and the phone rings, and it's Ozzy and his assistant. They're in the back seat of their town car on one of those old 80s style, like car phones, not like the modern phones we have now, but like the old ones from like circa 1987, something like that. So there's a lot of kind of background noise, and I'm talking to Ozzy and his assistant, and they both have heavy British accents. And they're trying to phone in a Starbucks order before they arrive to the studio, is basically what's going on. And what they told me was they wanted from Starbucks an Americano with ice. And I knew zero about ordering at Starbucks back then because I had never been inside a Starbucks until I started working at this studio and getting drink orders for other people. And when they said Americano with ice, I thought that was kind of the British way of saying an iced Americano. So I wrote down the order, said, "Hey, no problem. I'll handle it personally." I went and pulled some petty cash, and I jammed up to Starbucks to go ahead and, get that order. So I go into Starbucks, I get the iced Americano, and I go running back to the studio, and I see the town car parked out front. So I know Ozzy and his assistant have arrived. And I announce myself. I go into the lounge, and I hand the drink to Ozzy, and he's staring at me like I've got 2 heads. And I can't figure out what's wrong. And, he's like, "What the fuck is this, man?" And I go, "Did you not order an iced Americano?" And the producer was right there and he goes, "No, mate, Ozzy wants a hot Americano, but he wants ice on top so that when he drinks on it, he doesn't burn his mouth on the hot coffee." And, oh, shit. So jam back up to Starbucks, grab the coffee, make sure there's ice on top of it, and that sort of thing. So I was pretty embarrassed by that, but I was new and still kind of learning the ropes, and it was just, misunderstanding. Could have happened to anybody. So I thought that was kind of funny. Another story that I witnessed that I thought was pretty funny was, to give you some context, each studio also has a lounge attached to it with like a TV, some couches, some chairs, some tables, just a place to cool out, smoke, have a drink, watch some TV or whatever. And being that this facility was a little older, the construction wasn't quite up to par with what we might have today. Like, in other words, like your brand new studios are probably going to be pretty close to like soundproof. These studios were a little older, so they were a little more like sound resistant. Like there were times you could hear things through the doors or through the walls and stuff like that. So I'm walking down the hallway doing something, and Ozzy's in the lounge next to me. And all of a sudden I just hear screaming, like like loud screaming, and it's Ozzy, and it's obvious that it's Ozzy. Like I recognize his voice instantly, and I'm like, "What the hell's going on in there?" And all of a sudden the door flies open, and the engineer comes out, and he kind of like shuts the door behind him, and he looks really shook up. I was like, "Bro, what the hell is going on in there?" And the engineer says to me, "I don't know, man." He says, "We had the TV on, we were watching MTV Cribs, and Tommy Lee from Motley Crue's house came on, and Ozzy just started losing his shit and screaming at the TV." So I don't know what it was about Tommy Lee's house that set Ozzy off. Maybe he's living too nice, something like that. But I thought that was pretty freaking funny, personally. Now, one of the coolest things that happened with Ozzy wasn't even on an Ozzy session. It was on a Paul McCartney session. And I'm going to do a whole series of podcasts on Paul McCartney because it was just mind-blowing stuff. But a couple months after Ozzy left, and Ozzy was a huge Paul McCartney fan, by the way. Ozzy, I guess, apparently didn't particularly like doing duets, but one thing he always wanted to do was do a duet with Sir Paul McCartney. So I'm in Paul McCartney's studio one night cleaning up, and I'm kind of organizing some paperwork and, kind of shuffling things around, and this like handwritten note falls out from the paperwork that I was going through, and I like pick it up and look at it, and I recognize Ozzy's signature on it, so I start reading the note, and it says, "Dear Sir Paul, please would you play some bass on my record, or I will come and sing on yours. All the best, Ozzy." And me and one of the other production assistants were in there, and we're both like losing our shit. We're like, what? Like, no freaking way. Now, my first thought was to grab this thing and keep it, but I am not a thief, first and foremost. Also, how are you going to steal from Paul McCartney, man? That ain't right. And to be fair, maybe he didn't want it. Maybe he didn't give a crap. Like, who really knows? But it certainly was not the right thing to do, but I still wanted this thing. So we basically went and made a photocopy of it, which I still have to this day. And to be fair, another PA or somebody else probably ended up with it and has it in their archives or has it framed or something like that. But I thought that was just like the coolest thing to come across in my role as a production assistant in the studio. So I know that this episode is mainly supposed to be about Ozzy and all that, but really it's kind of about the whole experience working with Ozzy and that sort of thing. So I want to give Zakk Wylde a huge shout out, because I will tell you right now, I've seen a lot of talent in this world and in my life, and there might not be a greater talent out there than Zakk Wylde. I mean, that man just absolutely shreds. I mean, he is so good at guitar, it's borderline frightening. So we had Zakk in and out of the studio quite a bit, and Zakk was also a very intimidating guy. He's a big man. He's muscular. He kind of dresses like a biker. He's got, like long hair and this big beard and stuff. And he's got kind of a gruff voice, and he's just got kind of that big alpha male presence. So I was a little intimidated by Zakk, but he actually turned out to be a very warm and friendly and sweet guy. And I often did a lot of favors for him. I would often take his guitars to be repaired or his tube amps to be serviced, and obviously got a lot of food and beer and stuff for him. But like the way Zakk used to record back then before he stopped drinking was they'd put a chair on the left side of the studio, put a case of beer in front of him in like one of the old school like ice chests, and he had a big pile of guitar picks like sitting on the wing of the console. And his guitar picks were like custom, they were like custom made for Zakk. And he'd take like a swig of beer and be like, "All right, roll the tape, brother," and just liquid fingers, man. This guy had just absolutely shredded. So since our jobs were to clean the studios up at night when everybody left and stuff, yeah, I'm not a thief, but maybe we would just grab a guitar pick here and there. It's like, who's going to know? He's got a big pile of them there. He's not going to miss one. So it was customary for us to grab a guitar pick from now and again and sort of save them for our archives. So I remember one night when the sessions were over and we were like cleaning up the studio for good for the next client to come in, I was helping Zakk load up his truck, with all of his gear and stuff. And I come walking in, and Zakk calls me over. He's like, "Come here, brother." He's like, "Hold out your hands." And I hold out both my hands, and he grabs a big old pile of guitar picks off the console, and he drops them in my hand and says, "I don't know, man, trade them for some fucking beers or something." And I just thought that was like the funniest things, because we had been secretly kind of picking them off as we went. And then here he just gives me like a huge handful of them. I ended up selling a lot of them on eBay. I still have probably 4 or 5 of them left. I'll probably frame them up or something someday, maybe even frame them with that photocopy of that letter that I, photocopied and kept. But, I can't stress enough how good Zakk Wylde is at guitar. I mean, it's one thing to see him on stage, and I've seen him at Ozfest multiple times, playing with the band and stuff. It's one thing to see him perform on stage with a band and all that. It's another thing to be standing a couple feet away and just watch him by himself, just like shredding on stuff. And I remember one night, and again, the studios aren't exactly soundproof, and Zakk was recording some solos, and he had two Marshall half stacks just absolutely cranked. I mean, to like 11, like where these poor tube amps were just going to melt down, and we could hear everything through the wall. And back where they were recording was our coffee station. And I would say on average, I made about 75 pots of coffee a day, just to give you an idea. And me and one of the other PAs are back there making coffee, but we're sort of taking our time because we want to listen to Zakk cut these solos. And he would play stuff that was just so crazy. I mean, me and the other guy would just look at each other. We didn't even have to talk. Like, we were just communicating like telepathically. Like, what did I just hear? Like, just super mind-blowing, crazy stuff. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, my experience, spending a couple months with Ozzy, in and out. Like I said, I never really got on a first-name basis with him or really got to know him. I mean, sometimes when you work with these artists for a protracted length of time, they become friends. Sometimes they almost become like extended family. But I sort of felt like with Ozzy, like every time I walked in the room, I was a stranger to him. It was sort of like I felt like, even though I'd seen him before and done favors for him before, it was sort of like he was seeing me for the first time, which is fine. He meets a lot of people. He's, been a lot of places. I don't expect him to remember, some kid working in a studio making a minimum wage. I totally get it. But I found Ozzy to be one of the most interesting hangs I've ever had. I don't really consider myself particularly starstruck normally. I'm the kind of guy who kind of treats the biggest rock star the same as I treat the janitor. But there have been a few times in life when I've been starstruck, and Ozzy was definitely one of them. It was hard not to watch him when he was in the studio. He strikes me as having like a type A personality, which means he can't really sit around idle for too long. So I noticed whenever I was in the studio, kind of waiting around to do stuff for people, like he was always just up, just fidgeting around. Like he didn't really like to sit there and do nothing. And it was hard not to just watch him the whole time. So anyway, that's my story about working with Ozzy Osbourne. If you like my podcast and like what I'm doing, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll be coming at you again soon, live and direct, with more of my Hollywood stories. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being part of our program. I'm Mr. Pitiful. Peace out.
This program is continued on the opposite side.